This presentation is all about observational research in psychology. We're talking here about naturalistic observation. So in this method, people are studied in their natural environment. The researcher does not interfere in any way, so there's no independent or dependent variables, and they're usually looking for particular types of behaviour. Obviously, you have an aim before you start off. What's really important to say here is observation can be used as part of an experiment. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about observation as a data collection method. We're talking about it as a research method. So for example, if I got participants to solve a puzzle in a hot or a cold room, and then I observe them to see how stressed they look, I'm using an observation as part of my experiment to collect the data. But I'm still manipulating an IV and I'm measuring the DV through observation. So in this case, observation is not the research method. It's still an experiment because there's an IV and a DV. Observation is being used as a data collection method within an experiment. So there are four main types of naturalistic observation: structured, unstructured, covert and overt. And then, of course, there's participant observation, which is where the researcher gets involved. And any of those four types of observation can be participant as well. So a structured observation is where the researcher's already decided what they're looking for. So they'll have a checklist. And what they'll do is they'll tally up every time a particular behaviour occurs. So it generates quantitative data. The big issue here, though, is researcher bias. Operational definitions, which are your definitions that you've put in your checklist, what counts as a behaviour, can be an issue. So sometimes researchers work out a coding system in advance. Another decision the researcher needs to make is, are they just going to sit there and observe everything, or are they going to have a sampling technique for sampling behaviour? And the main types are event and time sampling. And in a way, a structured observation is an event sampling because you're looking for certain types of behaviour, and that's when your observation starts. So time sampling then involves observations at set intervals of time. So it might be 3-hourly observations or every 5 minutes for a certain period of time. The most famous one that you will have come across, of course, here is Bandura, who used time sampling in his observation of children in their responses to the Bobo doll. And event sampling involves observing a particular chosen behaviour and recording that behaviour every time it happens. So let's evaluate time and event sampling. So time sampling, there's a greater chance of sampling the behaviour of how a variety of different people act. So it's much more representative, but it's more time consuming as you have to watch behaviour over certain set time intervals. Event sampling is useful because when behaviour is recorded and it only happens occasionally, you might miss it if you were using time sampling. With event sampling, though, the observer still might miss some observations, and of course the sample you choose to observe may not be representative, as you're only watching over one event and not at all intervals. So if we evaluate structured observation, first of all, it generates quantitative data, which is easy to analyse, and it's quite reliable. The weaknesses, though, we've got researcher bias, which comes into our operational definitions, and we might miss behaviours that are not on our list. So something important might happen that we hadn't thought about. So unstructured observation, completely the opposite. So here the researcher just records all the action. So they note down the observations as they see them. And data can be quantitative or qualitative. And it's useful as a first step, but it can be difficult to accurately record all that happened. In an unstructured observation, we often use two observers, which is known as inter-rater reliability, and this increases the accuracy or the reliability of the observation, but we'll talk more about that later. So to evaluate unstructured observation, we can get qualitative detail, which is more detailed and in-depth. We can find serendipitous findings. The definition of serendipitous is a happy accident. So unlike structured observation, where we've already decided what we're looking for, we might observe the unexpected, which could be really useful. An unstructured observation is often the first step in research. Does anything interesting happen? Do we need to investigate it further? So the weakness then is researcher bias. And again, one of the ways we can try and overcome this is by inter-rater reliability. It's difficult to record absolutely everything that's going on, and it's much harder to analyse because of that qualitative data. So covert observation. Covert observation basically means undercover. So the participants are unaware that they are being observed, and that of course reduces demand characteristics and social desirabilities. Participants act much more naturally, but it can be unethical because we haven't got participants' consent. Now, one of the things that we must do because of this is we must really take care not to invade people's privacy. It's okay to conduct covert observation in public places where people might reasonably expect their behaviour will be observed, but not in private. And in psychological research, you're not allowed to record observations using audio or video unless you've got the participants' consent. So in other words, you have to do an overt observation if you want to record it. So ethics then. As we've said, the ethics are about consent and deception, right to withdraw. People don't know they're being observed, so they can't have given you your consent. Well, if they found out later, they might feel that they've been deceived. And of course, if they don't know they're being observed, there's no right to withdraw either. So where could we conduct a covert observation ethically? And the basic answer to that is in a public place. So evaluation of covert observation. There's no demand characteristics or social desirability because people don't know they're being observed, so they act much more naturally. But of course, the big weakness is ethics. There's no consent. So the opposite of a covert observation is an overt one. Participants are fully aware that they are being observed. So that makes it much more ethical. They've given their consent. But of course, the big problem is they might change their behaviour. If you've ever been in a classroom when there's an inspector or your teacher's being observed, you'll know exactly what happens with that. So strengths is very ethical, but the weaknesses, demand characteristics and social desirability. So participant observation. The researcher is part of the action they're observing. It's a much more natural arrangement, but it's difficult to take notes when you're joining in. And another problem, of course, is researcher bias. It's likely that the researcher will influence the action taking place. So the strengths, it's much more natural. The weaknesses, it's difficult to take accurate notes when you're joining in. And another problem is researcher bias. It's likely that the researcher will influence the action taking place. So let's look at reliability and validity. You should be already familiar with these terms because you will have looked at them when you've looked at experiments too. So our definition, remember, reliability is about consistency. If we could repeat something, would we get the same results? And validity is about measurement. Are we measuring exactly what we set out to measure? Now, the problem with an observation is you can't repeat it because it's a moment in time. You could do something similar, but it'd never be exactly the same. So one way to assess reliability of an observation is through inter-rater reliability. So having two or more observers trained in the same way to observe the action, given the same checklist or the same instructions, and then at the end comparing their results. The general rule is that if they are in 80% or more agreement about what went on, then the data has high inter-rater reliability. So how can we increase reliability and validity in observations? So for validity, we can carry out covert observations so the participants don't change their behaviour. We can have a double bind so that the observer who's taking notes doesn't know the aim of the study, so that reduces observer bias. and we can have a clearly operationalised coding system that's been checked and double checked to make sure it's measuring what it's set out to measure. To increase our reliability, again, that operationalised coding system will increase reliability. We can check inter-rater reliability. We can train our researchers to use the coding system within that inter-rater reliability, and we can conduct a pilot study to check behavioural categories. Okay, I hope that presentation has helped you to understand observation as a research method. Please make sure you read the relevant chapter in your textbook and have a look at past paper questions on observational research to ensure you really understand it. Thank you for your attention.